Hey, let's roll. Hello, everyone, and welcome to TPN Talks. Today, we're going to be looking at the recently held US-EU summit with Peter Rashish, who's Vice President and Director of the Geoeconomics program at the American-German Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Thanks for being with us, Peter. Peter, you've been a great friend to TPN over the years, and so I'm delighted to be able to ask you to share your readout of what happened and what didn't happen at the summit, which took place just a week ago from Friday back to last Friday. Thanks for agreeing to be with us. And let me turn to ask a first question, if I may. Leading into the summit, there'd been some doubt that the summit might need to have been postponed because of the crisis in the Middle East and President Biden visiting Israel immediately before. It didn't get postponed, and the summit statement was able to summarize transatlantic cooperation across a whole range of agenda items. How important is it that the summit took place? And at a general level, do you think it was successful? Was it a worthwhile exercise?
Well, Jeffries, thanks for inviting me to be with you. I think that it was worthwhile. I say that mainly because it was very strong on geopolitical alignment, even if it came up short on geoeconomic statecraft. And I say that if you look at what you alluded to, the very striking unity of the two sides, and their sort of common purpose and values when it comes to both Ukraine and Israel. But I would also say that was true on China. There weren't any new measures announced exactly, but certainly on the geopolitical side, there was strong language about their mutual concerns, but also on the geoeconomic side, there was a lot of commonality on the desire to de-risk and reduce one-sided dependencies, in their supply chains. And there was even, I think, what could be, if you read the tea leaves a bit, some indirect language on potential shared approaches on export controls and outward investment screening. So I think that kind of commonality was I think important to demonstrate, but I think also it showed it was kind of a balanced approach to China, because they also talked about the need to work with China on macroeconomic stability, debt sustainability, and climate issues, and so a lot on geopolitics, a lot on China, but very little on the bilateral trade issues.
Got it. So going into the summit, two key ambitions were to reach agreement on a solution to the steel aluminum tariff dispute, and also to agree a critical minerals agreement that would allow EU industry to access the benefits of the US Inflation Act. And neither of those two agreements were reached. Negotiations will continue. But why do you think they couldn't get to agreement? And is that because there are some really core philosophical differences driving the failure to agree, or what do you think it was behind that?
I think I would look at those two issues separately: the critical minerals agreement and the steel and aluminum talks. And I would be more optimistic about the critical minerals agreement. To me, that's a little bit more like a traditional trade negotiation where the two sides have some different views and different emphases, but I don't see any real red lines. I mean, right now they're trying to work out how to approach some environment and labor issues, but I'm reasonably confident that they will do so. I mean, it's also probably worth mentioning that since the U.S. Treasury Department decided that electric vehicles that are leased would not be subject to a lot of the sourcing issues that purchased ones would be, Some of the sting has been taken out of the issue, but I still think it would be good for both the EU and for transatlantic relations if they could, actually, have a meeting of the minds on that. I mean, as for the steel and aluminum talks, the gas, as we call it over here, I think that's going to be harder, not impossible, but I think harder, and for two reasons at least. One is that the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM, which is its principal means to decarbonize, and the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the US approach, are not perfectly compatible. The first one for the EU is based on a domestic carbon price, which then will use tariffs to adjust for that, while the second one is based on subsidies. So the EU's is focusing on sticks and the US on carrots. The second reason I'm a little bit, sober, let's say, about the chances for it is that when you talk to economists, most of them will tell you that it's preferable to have just one target for each policy measure, while the steel and aluminum talks are trying to target both overcapacity of steel production and carbon intensive production with the single mechanism of the GASA. So I think that's also making negotiations more difficult. And it's interesting because there were reports just before the summit that the US and the EU were thinking of separating out these two issues and treating them individually.
Right. At least they're still talking. They are still negotiating, and so we can hope for something perhaps in the later part of the year or early next year. One thing that they also talked about and looked forward to was a likely December meeting of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, the ministerial, as they referred to it. And although they didn't get into the details of the agenda as such, the summit communique pretty much rehearsed many, if not all, of the issues that are in the TTC working group kind of process. What are you hearing? What do you see, and what do you think about that TTC process and its progress, and how things are looking for December?
Well, let me just go back to what you said about the GASA talks. I mean, they are being extended, and what I said is probably focusing a little more on the short term. But I do think that if they're given more time, and particularly until after the U.S. presidential election, after the elections in Europe next year, and you take some of the political kind of intensity out of it, I would be more optimistic that they will reach an agreement. But on the Trade and Technology Council, I don't hear anything saying that it's not going to be planned as held before the end of the year. And I think that with the summit, I think it's fair to say, and not having produced much on the trade and economic front, I think, the two sides will be eager to show some progress on those issues. And, I think if you look at the issues that are likely to be high on the agenda, the TTC has already made some good progress on artificial intelligence. So I expect that to be there. But I also think that fleshing out this idea of a transatlantic initiative on sustainable trade, which was launched last year, will probably also be a focus. Especially if by the end of, by the time of the next meeting, which should be soonish, that there's no further progress on the steel and aluminum talks or the critical mineral talks, which are in this same kind of trade and climate space. So I think they'll want to show that on those very important issues, the US and the EU have got something, that they're united and have got something to show for themselves.
Got it, thanks. And you mentioned, or you looked out into the medium term, and certainly over the next 24 months of transatlantic relations, we've got elections and potentially some political turbulence ahead. Do we need to worry that the fabric of cooperation that's been rebuilt since President Biden came to office could be undermined? Is there more that could be done to insulate transatlantic relations. And I say that because, of course, TPN has been arguing for some upgrading in stakeholder engagement by legislators to support the transatlantic relationship and the work done inside it, and also for more civil society engagement. And by that we mean of business, of course, but recognizing that for the administration that also means labor. And we've also been sort of wondering whether a new declaration could capture declaration to supplement, replace, or whatever the 1990 declaration, which is already getting a little bit old, could supplement and capture, in a useful way, the current focus for transatlantic ambition. So I wonder if you could sort of pick up on any of those points about the turbulence and the risks and anything that could be done about it.
Sure. I think in normal transatlantic times, and I would characterize, the current moment as, in that way, my sense is if you have trust and good communication channels and the right kind of institutions, that we usually see some progress, at least in some areas. And I think an example of that is over in the last 2 years, the way the US and EU have worked so closely together on Russia. Whether that's because of the TTC or because of their common engagement in the G7. So I think that, when you have those good fundamentals, you usually have progress. I think what's important to think about is when there are times when there are political tensions or when you have differing ideologies between governments on the two sides of the Atlantic. And then in that case, I'm not as confident that the right kind of structures for cooperation can guarantee a good result. And so I think if we end up being in that kind of world for one reason or another, then I think it's really important. Then the substance is important. I think it's really important to focus on one or two issues that we know are of political value to both sides. That issue could be China, that could be, manufacturing and jobs, or that could be AI. But I think then you need to really focus on the issue. Now, that said, I do think, for example, that the idea of getting more buy-in from legislators on both sides of the Atlantic is incredibly important. The parliamentarians are close to their constituents, and they're a very wide, there's a very wide range of constituents on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think finding a way to have them, for example, be connected to the Trade and Technology Council would be a good idea. And as for a declaration, I think you're right. I mean, it's been more than 30 years. And while a declaration is not a substitute for action, I think at the right interval, something like that can be useful for as a kind of statement of where the two sides are, and a statement of, frankly, what's changed since the last declaration, and how they're looking forward together to handle the new world that's arisen, since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, great, right. I want to close, if I may, by asking you really for your sense of the geopolitical status of transatlantic partnership relations, whatever. The world in which transatlantic relationship, or the transatlantic relationship, plays is, the commonly observed factors are well known: Ukraine and now the Middle East on the security challenges, China and its integration into the global polity, you might say, and now, particularly this year, the re-emergence or emergence of, a competing voice through a kind of expanding BRICS focus and initiative. So my question is really looking at the transatlantic partnership from the outside. What does it, in your view, amount to in reality? Is it more about rhetorical assertions of ambitions and values and that can serve its purpose, or is it a real hard-edged clearinghouse for global leadership solutions and actions, or what kind of combination of rhetoric and reality do you see, and how would you judge it right now?
I don't really see any overwhelming evidence that other parts of the world are coalescing more effectively than the US and the EU have been over the last couple of years or so, let's say. I do think the TTC is working well. The G7, where the US and EU really play predominant roles, is once again very dynamic and innovative, while the G20 seems to be a little less effective. You see the US engagement with Asia and IPEF and with Latin America and APEP. So I think I'm not too concerned about the level of engagement or cohesion by the US or the EU individually or together compared to whatever other grouping you want to mention, right now. That doesn't mean I think, we should just sort of sit back and relax. I think that, the US and the EU do need to continue to reach out, and probably with different new countries and in new ways, to country, especially to countries that are either currently or potentially sort of like-minded in the way they view global economic issues. And that could be to create a climate club for decarbonization. It could be to promote ethical use of AI, or it could be for, friend-shoring of supply chains so they're more resilient and, with reliable partners. So that means, to me, big countries of the global South like India, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, there are a few others. And, I think that the US and EU are doing some of this. I think for example, the EU's pending, let's say, trade agreement with the four Mercosur countries in South America is one way. You see some plurilateral negotiations that either, could be brought back, like the environmental goods agreement in the WTO, or still ongoing, like e-commerce there. But I also think that we need to be open to the idea that we might, the US and EU might need some entirely new kinds of agreements and institutions to do this. I think that, it's important that they manage their differences. But I think it's also important to be kind of grasp the kind of moment we're in. And I think it's one of those moments where, where I think about what Jean Monnet said, the man who was the inspiration for the coal and steel community, when he said that, something like Europe will be forged, by its crises and by the some of the kind of reactions they have to what they build from these crises. And I think we're in, history doesn't repeat itself, but I do think we're in a moment which bears some resemblance to the post-war period 75 years ago. And I think, the US and the EU do need to be innovative, and they need to think about reform to existing structures, but I think they also need to think about whether together they should build something new, either alongside existing structures or to replace one or more of them, given the fact that we are in one of those kind of really formative moments. I think that we don't see that often, but it's important to realize when you're in one of those.
Got it. Thank you, Peter. That was extremely useful, and if I may say so, really well informed and insightful. So thank you very much for sharing that readout with us and for being with us as well. And thank you for your support over the many years as well. So we look forward to continuing to be great friends with you and John Hopkins as well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Jeffries. It's great being with you.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's a wrap. So the rest will be down to